Hello, welcome to the holiday special of the Six Queens podcast. First holiday special, I should say, which is exciting. Just in case you were wondering, we have come dressed in festive garb. We got Kate sporting a lovely Christmas hat, very nicely modelled. I'm sad the others can't see it now.
Well, apparently I have to be the one to model the festive headwear while you bring the festive apparel. I love your jumper.
Thank you. I love a reindeer and an ugly Christmas jumper. I have to say, the uglier the better.
I know, I don't have one. I have to stick to the hats, apparently.
That is fine. I'm excited for your Easter bonnet, though, in the next year.
I have to work on that.
But no, we're back, and dare I say, bigger and better than ever, with a newly formed Instagram page. So if you haven't already gone and found us on Instagram, that's Six Queens Pod. So go and give us a follow.
We're also finally on all of the major podcast apps, so Spotify, Apple, and Google. I know it's been a long time coming, but we are there. So if you're listening to us on any of those apps, good for you. If you are not, go find us there and give us a follow, leave a review, all that jazz.
We love that. This episode is coming to you from the UK on Boxing Day. So you guys don't have Boxing Day in the States, though, do you?
Well, we have December 26th, but it is not known as Boxing Day.
Well, I'd imagine the date still exists, yeah. It just goes 25-27.
No, it's just the day after Christmas. So it's not a thing. It is sort of a casual observance of, you sit around with your family and you think, what now? But it is not a designated holiday for us as it is for you.
For those of you thinking, what now? Go find us on our new platform to go listen to us. I'm sure you've got a fun new device, maybe like a speaker or something that you could blast us through. So that's exciting. This episode, we are going to be focusing on New Year's gift giving. And I bet you're all sitting there wondering, why New Year's? Why not Christmas gift giving? Well, that is an excellent question. And that is something we're going to be having a look through and having a chat about through this episode.
I'm Kate.
I'm Callie.
We're two friends who met in an early modern history MA.
Welcome to the Six Queens podcast,
where queenship reigns supreme.
So I think it's worth probably stating, Christmas for the Tudors, much like I suppose it is for us now, is a time of rest for a lot of people, but it looks a little bit different. Christmas was observed throughout the Tudor period over a course of 12 days, known as the 12 Days of Christmas. The kind of run-up to the 12 Days of Christmas was called Advent, and that was the time for kind of fasting and getting ready for the 12 Days of Christmas. And again, much like our Christmas, it was a period of rest for a lot of people, especially people who worked the land and were employed as spinners. So unless you're in charge of the livestock, you actually got a bit of time off and would go back to work on Plough Monday, which is the day after the 12 Days of Christmas ends, which is usually the 7th.
Of course, we are talking about the Tudor court, and not a lot of people observed Plough Monday in the Tudor court, as you can imagine. So we're going to be focusing on the 12 Days of Christmas celebration at court, which was a huge thing that people looked forward to all year. It was one of the times during the year that everybody at court came together. There was a lot of feasting. And as Callie said, there was 12 days of this. So every day kind of had a different theme, purpose, I might say. Christmas Day was the kickoff day, and then it went all the way to January 6th, which is 12th night, or the Feast of the Epiphany, when the wise men came to Bethlehem to see the baby Jesus. So from Christmas until then, pretty much every day there is some feast or party or religious significant event. We are going to be focusing on a day in the middle of the 12, which is New Year's Day. And this was a day when there was a really big celebration at court. There was a formal court, meaning that the king and the queen wore their crowns. There was a feast. There was a time when they went to church to hear a mass. And it was also a day when they exchanged gifts.
As Kate was saying, the formal court was held at the Tudor court. As Henry's reign kind of progressed, the court itself, and especially the Christmas court, became a lot more lavish in the way that gifts were given and with the way gifts were exchanged, really. What was happened was a formal gift-giving ceremony where presents were displayed, and it's quite interesting the way that the gift exchange is documented and the way it's kind of handled. I think during the earlier years of Henry's reign, especially, it was quite an intimate thing where gifts were exchanged in private in the private chambers of the king and the queen. And then as his reign progressed and his court became more lavish and he became more of the centre of court, I think it's fair to say that ritual of gift giving was moved more into the public setting at court. It became more a formalised ritual where gifts were presented and then displayed in a kind of hierarchical sense. You know, they were out on display. I don't think it'd be unfair to say that much like everything else in Henry's court, this could be seen as a sort of test of loyalty from his courtiers. And if your gift was accepted and displayed prominently, it was sort of seen as, you're in favour with the king. Whereas, if they weren't accepted, and we've got a lovely example of that being a bit awkward a bit later for one of our queens, is, they were returned to you and the king wouldn't receive them.
Yeah, this was seen as a very political thing. It could be intimate, as you said, but most of the gifts given by the king and to the king or the queen, it was a political move. So all of the gifts would be on display. Everybody would know who got the king what. Everybody would know who got what from the king. So if you were in or out of favor, this was a really nice sort of temperature check. And obviously, the other courtiers would know if you weren't giving the king or the queen a nicer gift than you probably should. But it's interesting that with the growing of the ceremony into something more elaborate, because, by the end of the Tudor period, by the reign of Elizabeth, this was a really big, lavish ceremony. In Henry VIII's reign, though, we see it becoming a little bit more, clinical. Like, there were some gifts that were a little bit more intimate, like Henry might give one of his wives a more intimate gift and, vice versa, they to him. But he would also hand out gifts to his courtiers in general. There would even be gifts for the staff, the servants. Those gifts were usually a bit less, not impressive, but not as personal. They would be something like plate, like goblets or plates made of gold or silver, depending on your status. They could be gifts of money, cash. They could be gifts of small jewels. They were usually something that wasn't as, personal. You might give your ladies in waiting, say, the same goblet embossed with a Tudor rose or whatever your queenly badge is, as their yearly gift, instead of something like we would do, like I bought you this necklace because it reminds me of you. It's let me commission all of these plate to give out at New Year's because I need to give my courtier something.
Right, and I think like you said, it's the difference between giving someone a necklace because it reminded you of them to, oh, here's a box of chocolates because I forgot to get them and I picked them up at the gas station or something. Well, it's not as distinct as that. I think, the intimacy associated with each gift could be seen in that sort of way.
And it must have been frustrating for some of the courtiers because there's this competition within the circles to get Henry something really impressive. Like we can see that in the letters of Lord and Lady Lisle, who are living in Calais at the time. They're really fretting over what to give the king every year for New Year's. And they know it has to be impressive because if it's not, other people will know that it's not impressive. And it really says something about your status, what your New Year's gift to the king is. And also it was the added pressure of you presenting it to the king himself. After the king and queen woke up on New Year's Day, they probably went to a church service. There was a feast at the end of the day, but before that, they would sit in state and receive these gifts. And like Callie said, they'd be out on display. So there was the added pressure of seeing his face when you gave him the thing. So you better hope that it's impressive.
Literally. And I think it's really interesting that you picked up on the Lyles, because as you said, they were in Calais. So I think it's fair to say that Lord Lisle was always a bit bit worried about his position, especially being so far away from the physical presence of Henry and away from court itself, which is where, a lot of people would gain their gain traction and kind of move their way up in the world. And there's a really lovely example, and I think it comes from 1534. I can't remember exactly what the gift was, but Lyle had someone present the gift to Henry and then immediately write to him what was said about it, what was Henry's reaction and things like that. And I think the response was he received it right joyly. And I can almost imagine this kind of very relieved Lyle just like sinking back in his chair and just wiping the sweat off his forehead, like, stay for another year, I can keep doing what I'm doing.
And you save some face with your peers, your fellow courtiers, in that way. But I'm just thinking too, like, after you go to all the trouble to, commission something really great for the king and the queen, and you present it, or you have somebody present it and give you the status update, in return, Henry's assistant, or like, I'm imagining like the Devil Wears Prada, like somebody like an Anne Hathaway standing next to him, handing you a plate, like a silver plate, like, yep, here you go, Happy New Year. And you're like, oh, thanks, it's the same one that, like the Duke of Norfolk got. Wow, great. The same souvenir, like, Hampton Court 2021.
But I think as well, just picking up on that idea as well, I think a lot of the time you can kind of see people who knew their fates were sort of they were all right because it'd get him something very similar each year, and it was always well received. For other people, they had to kind of pull out all the stops and go hard or go home, really.
And the same was true for our queens. Though, again, we talk about Henry as the center of this court, gifts were being given to the queen and by the queen in much the same way. They don't tend to be as well documented as the ones that Henry was getting, unfortunately, but we do know that she was giving and receiving gifts, especially to people within her household. So the queen's ladies in waiting could expect something from their mistress every year. She might also give things to the men in Henry's household because Henry gave gifts to the women in the queen's household. And in some cases, you would give a gift to your stepchildren as well. So there's evidence of Jane Seymour and Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr giving gifts to Henry's children for New Year, this sort of happy family thing. And we also know that the queens, in much the same way, would give these sort of standardized gifts. Some were more impressive than others, but it was sort of the same ritual as giving the king a gift, but maybe a little bit on a lesser scale. And I think it's interesting that when you read the accounts of these gifts, especially where concern the queens, you get a very, very accurate portrait and an interesting, different portrait of what's going on personally in the lives of the queens, especially as concerns their relationship with Henry.
100%. Like, there's really, you can't interpret it any other way, can you? What they were giving him and then what he was giving them, it's very, very clear. And I think that the presence that they really had at court as well is quite interesting because, again, it's that physical association with Henry as well as what he's giving you or really what he's not giving or receiving from you. So I think one of the kind of best examples that we really have of that is Catherine of Aragon, bless her soul, being expelled from court, and then on New Year, Anne Boleyn being installed in her apartment at that very sort of intimate time, really, where everyone was all together and everybody would know exactly what's going on. I suppose a bit more than any other time of year because everyone was there.
You can also see the relationships growing and waning. So waning in that sense of that year that Catherine was banished from court, she did not receive a New Year's gift. And growing in the sense of you can see when Jane Seymour starts to be noticed a little bit more because she appears on the New Year's rolls in 1534. And though she's not receiving a personal gift from Henry, she's getting one of those standardized souvenir plates as part of Anne's retinue. It's still, she appears for the first time on that list. And you can really see that impact of like, oh, wow, in 4 years, she's going to be queen.
But I think it goes back to that idea of everything at court is politicized. Everything at court has a meaning. And while it is Christmas, 12 days of Christmas and, everyone's very festive and jolly, there is that underlying reminder of, I've got to keep putting my best foot forward. now is not the time to slip.
And if you did slip in the year, this would be the time where the king would probably make you remember it, and everyone would notice. It would be recorded, like maybe the imperial ambassador Eustache Chapuis would be there, and he's a notorious gossip. So a lot of what we know that went down at the Tudor Christmas court is through Chapuis. So, thank you, bitter gossip Eustache. Everyone notices what you do at court, and I think with a ritual like this, it is very emphasized. Like, I know we've talked about this a lot, and we talked about this on our Hampton Court episode that we did in our last series about this idea that everything at court is observed. It's a stage for performing politics. The New Year's gift-giving ceremony is really like, I can't stress it enough that this is your moment to shine if you want to. And if you messed up during the year, this is the time where everyone's going to know. It's like, imagine a secret Santa party at your office Christmas party, except your boss is the only one getting gifts, and everyone will know if you just get him like a stapler or something.
Sorry, I love this idea of Chapuis being almost like Gossip Girl, just like XOXO Chapuis. It's not unnoticed, and I think one of the clearest examples of that, as we mentioned, Catherine of Aragon being not only expelled from court that year in 1531, she also didn't receive a gift from Henry, and the gift that she actually sent him was returned to her, with a very firm reminder about her place in his life, that she was no longer his wife, and she basically had no business giving him a gift.
And meanwhile, he's increasing the amount of gifts that he's giving to his, I say mistress in a loose term, but his mistress, Anne Boleyn. Catherine gets nothing. In fact, that year in the New Year's rolls, in the account of all of the gifts that the king gave and received, next to the queen is just left blank. Whereas Anne that year, Thomas Cromwell was the keeper of the jewel house at the time, and Henry gives him an order to deliver all of these jewels, silver and gold plate, all of this extremely expensive stuff. It's a whole list. We'll read it in the second half. It's really fascinating. She's getting all of these really lavish gifts, and Catherine gets nothing. If there's anything more telling than that as to the status of their relationship, please let me know.
I think it goes back to that idea of, silence speaking more than words, and, the silence being deafening. And I think for Catherine, since she'd been queen, that's really, other than 1511, after she'd just given birth to hers and Henry's son, who unfortunately didn't live for very long, that's the only time she misses court at Christmas, while she's still queen. The embarrassment and the isolation of that, I can't begin to imagine, because, again, we've discussed this before, but Catherine is a very proud woman with a very strong sense of who she is. It's not something she's going to get over easily.
And sorry, but I'm going to hit you all over the head with this. Everybody noticed. She wasn't there. She received nothing. Everybody knew. And like you said, she was a very proud woman, rightly so, because of her, her as a person and her status. She knew that she was being slighted. She knew that everybody knew she was being slighted. I just can't imagine how humiliating that must have been.
Absolutely. And I think when we couple it with who the guest of honor is at court that year.
Yeah, a few years before, the guest of honor at Christmas, at the Christmas court, had been Cardinal Campeggio, who was from the Vatican, and he was sent to England to basically get rid of Catherine. He was there to see if Henry's request for an annulled marriage was canonically valid, I guess. And Henry was like, okay, let's show him a good time. Let's butter him up. And meanwhile, Catherine's sitting at the high table like, this is awkward.
It's the equivalent of a Christmas car crash. When you watch a really bad Christmas movie and it's bad, but you can't look away. I'd imagine it being like for kind of courtiers around them, just watching what's going on, be like, oh, make it stop.
And again, it's not subtle on Henry's part. Everyone can see that there's this random Italian guy at the high table who's being wined and dined by Henry so that he can get rid of Henry's wife. So I don't know. It just, I wasn't even there, and I can feel the secondhand embarrassment.
A lot of the time, I often like to think I'd like to be a fly on the wall at court, because I just, you know how much I love courtly politics and just court life as a whole. But I'd take a day off that day. I'd be like, I got the plague. I'm sorry, I can't come in.
In the second half of the episode, which is imminent, we will be talking a little bit more about the details of the gifts that were given to and by the queens, a lot of which we have already alluded to. But we just wanted to give you the sort of taste of what was going on at court at New Year's and in the larger 12 days of Christmas. New Year's was one of the big days in that festival. It was a huge day at court. Everyone was there. Like we said, it was ceremonial. So the king and queen were in full splendor with their crowns and their nicest clothes. And then the gift giving was so important for a myriad of reasons. So in the second half, we will tell you more about the gifts that really stood out to us and the years too, the New Year's courts that are described in a little bit more detail by the record keepers, and just give you a taste of what their Christmases and New Year's were like. Now that you know all about what was happening on New Year's Day at the Tudor court, we wanted to relate it specifically to our queens and talk about some specific New Year's experiences of our queens, particularly through the gift giving, which, as we said, was very important sort of gauge of their romantic and political status, where they stood with Henry, both as his wife, queen, love interest, but also was she in favor politically? What was she giving to people to really cement her role as queen, etc. We went through the letters and papers of the Tudor court, which is a really awesome source. It's a Victorian calendar of papers, so Victorian archivists went through a lot of different Tudor sources and put together this compendium of all the different primary sources, so you can search them by date. So basically, just went to every January 1st during Henry VIII's reign to see what we could find, and this is what you're going to hear. You're going to hear some of the things that stood out to us the most. Not every queen is going to be covered in detail. Sorry about that. The records are just better for some than others, but we still got a lot of really interesting little tidbits for you.
And I think, honestly, with this, firstly, going through all of those papers and like letters and things is such fun.
Yeah, as I was going through them, reading, there would be some that were, thank you, Gossip Girl, Chapuis, that were just a lot more meatier than others. And I would text you like, oh my God, we have to use this. We have to quote this exactly because this is just so interesting. It's like all of the drama of the Tudor court can be seen in like one day of the year. Which I guess is true of everybody's Christmas. Like all the family drama comes out on Christmas, right? When you're all together. This is the Tudor equivalent of that.
So I know we brought it up briefly in the first half, but I think Catherine of Aragon is the, dare I say, queen, pun intended, of swings and roundabouts at New Year's Eve. I think they're probably the scene of her greatest triumph. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the source of her greatest embarrassment, really, or downfall. I suppose both. So in 1511, Catherine actually gave birth to Henry, who was nicknamed the New Year's Prince. So actually wasn't able to be present at court for the festivities. But what we do know is that Henry was, the eighth, I should say, because there's two Henrys now involved in this conversation, was absolutely over the moon. And I think it's somewhat, I don't know, I suppose symbolic really, that he happened to be born during the 12 days of Christmas, and especially on New Year's Day, where it was this kind of big celebration anyway, and then throwing a prince on top was just going to be the icing on the cake. And there's records of him ordering bonfires to be lit all across London and to celebrate the birth of his son, to coincide with the new year.
We've talked about this before, this idea of the queen's role and her biggest role being to give birth to male heirs. Catherine had already suffered a miscarriage earlier in her marriage, but this was the first living child that she gave birth to, and it was a boy. So, yeah, Henry was over the moon. And like you said, the fact that he was born during the time of year when we celebrate the birth of Christ, like the symbolism behind that is huge. People are already there at court celebrating, so why not make it better? Henry was really, really happy about this. There was a famous tourney that didn't happen during the 12 days of Christmas, but happened shortly after to celebrate the furthering of the Tudor dynasty. So this was really Catherine's big moment as queen. She gave birth to a son. But as we know, it didn't really work out well for her in the end.
No, not at all. And I think with this as well, for a man whose ego is so, well, as large as his waistline would become later down the line, the fact that, as you mentioned, it's all coinciding with, the time of year where Christ is born and things like that, and in a deeply religious society, I don't think that would have been lost on anybody.
Even more poignant than when a few weeks later, I think a month or 5 weeks or so later, little Prince Henry tragically dies.
Yeah, which, we've already discussed is not uncommon in this period. However, again, if we look at the symbolism attached to his birth and things like that, would have dealt an even bigger blow.
And then, as we touched on in the first half, in the 1530s, Catherine's New Year's celebrations just get progressively worse until she is not even there at all. First, Cardinal Campeggio is there as the guest of honor. And then in the subsequent years, it's like Catherine's role is lessened and lessened as Anne Boleyn becomes more influential and more in Henry's favor. And Henry is more willing to publicly declare his intentions towards Anne.
I think the fact that she was installed in Catherine's apartments around the celebration at court at Christmas is a big deal. Everybody's there. It's not going away. It's not escaping anybody's attention. And I think even more telling of her continual downward spiral is she actually gifted Henry a gold cup. As we kind of mentioned in the first half, all the gifts were displayed, and it was very public about which gifts he turned his nose up at and which ones he accepted and accepted well. Catherine's one wasn't even accepted. It was returned back to her. Not only was it returned back to her, but it was returned back to her with an air of, how dare you? Like, who do you think you are? You have no business doing this. Why are you putting me in a position? Why are you doing this to begin with? This is absolutely unacceptable. Don't ever think to do this again.
That happened Christmas 1531, New Year's 1532. So the gift was given to Henry on New Year's Day 1532. And I did want to read the account that Chapuis writes of that, just because Chapuis, as the imperial ambassador, so he was sending reports to Charles V, the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor. Obviously, that was Catherine's nephew, so Chapuis was very invested in what was going on with Catherine at the court, and as we can imagine, he was absolutely outraged by this incident, so he writes about it in particular detail, and I just wanted to read a little bit of it just so you all can see how dramatic and political this was. So Chapuis writes in his letter to Charles V on the 4th of January, 1532, "Though the Queen, in this case Catherine, has been forbidden to write or send messages to the king, she sent him a gold cup as a present with honorable and humble words. But the king refused it and was displeased with the person who presented it. 2 or 3 hours afterwards he looked at it and praised its fashion, and fearing that the person who presented it would return it to the queen's messenger, and that the latter might make a present of it publicly to the other, who could not refuse it, he ordered it not to be returned till the evening, and so it was sent back to the queen. The king has sent her no present, and has forbidden the council and others to do so, as is usual. He used to send New Year's presents to the ladies of the queen and the princess, but this has not been done this year. Thus they will lower the state of both, unless there is speedy remedy." And then Chapuis also notes later in that letter that, of course, Anne Boleyn is being showered with gifts, and he goes into those in a detail that we'll get to in a moment. But he correctly notes that this is going to be the beginning of the end for both Catherine and Mary, because not only are they not receiving gifts, Henry is not receiving their gifts, and he's also not giving gifts to their household. So they are it's like they're being completely wiped out.
And also, I think the thing I particularly enjoy about that extract is that Chapuis' awareness of his surroundings and being at court. If I was to send it straight back, it's going to look as though I was gifting it back to her and it was being perceived as a gift. We're not doing that. You know, we're nipping that straight in the bud. She can have it back in the evening. Yeah, it's awkward.
I mean, again, we've said this thousands of times, I think, by now, but it's just this idea that it's a game. It's a play. It's all so choreographed and orchestrated to the point of a marital spat. I guess more than a spat in this case, but you know, two married people fighting like this manifests itself in such a formal, ritualized way. Yeah, we can't stress enough how, you know, important this moment is. And I think Chapuis telling the emperor about this as an important event. It wasn't just like, hey, I know some drama went down at family Christmas you should know about. It's like a, hey, just to let you know, your aunt's really in trouble now.
But what I love most about it is that the ability to fight through ritual, right? So you're not having to have a screaming match in the middle of court, although that would have been fantastic. But just that sleight of hand, or, you know, receiving or not receiving a gift, or the time in which something is returned back to you, and, you know, the wider people around you that are implicated, is something deliciously Tudor, and I appreciate it. Although I feel terrible for Catherine.
Continuing with this specific entry by Chapuis, this brings us nicely into Anne Boleyn, because of course the Anne Boleyn stuff is happening sort of in tandem with the Catherine stuff. As Catherine's falling, Anne is rising. So in Chapuis's note to Charles, he goes on to say that Henry has not been so discourteous to the lady, which is one of his like shady nicknames for Anne, who has presented him with certain darts of Biscayan fashion richly ornamented. So this is Anne's gift to Henry that year. In return, Henry gave her a room hung with cloth of gold and silver and crimson satin with rich embroideries. She is lodged where the queen used to be and is accompanied by almost as many ladies as if she were queen. This is something we've talked about before. This is Anne taking formal possession of Catherine's rooms, and the significance of this on the sort of formal court end can not be understated, just because she is now possessing not only the physical space of the queen, but she has as many ladies as Catherine used to. And Henry, for his New Year's gift, is sending her furnishings for the rooms. Furnishings fit for a queen.
It's ginormous. Let's be real. Like, the rooms themselves have such a big significance about, you know, they are the rooms of the queen. So by Henry installing Anne in those rooms, he's all but saying she's queen without the name. You know, at this point, there's no turning back. It's very public at this point. You know, no one's missing this.
And looking at all of the gifts to and given by Anne, which we actually have a lot of documentation for. Anne was a patroness of the arts, so we have a lot of really interesting gifts that are in her accounts. But I think the theme that ties together all of the gifts given to and given by Anne is this idea of Anne being obsessed, but not in a negative way, about her appearance, how people perceive her and her queenship and her position. And whereas some other queens might be more wont to give a personal gift, Anne is about the show. She's playing the game of court. She's sending Henry lavish things. She's getting lavish things from Henry. She is in direct contest with Catherine, so she needs to make sure that she is eclipsing Catherine in every possible way. And a material way, a very showy way, is a really good place to make a statement.
It feeds into that idea of monarchical majesty, creating the illusion of, you know, in the image and the everything, all the trappings that go along with being a king or a queen. You know, it's not just the name. You know, we've mentioned this before, but I just bloody love it. And I think a particularly lovely example and kind of very obvious example of this is a gift that Anne has commissioned for Henry by Hans Holbein, which is the fountain. And I'll see if we can find a picture of it to pop on Twitter and Instagram. It's very ornate and it's very expensive, and it's something that Holbein would have had to spend a lot of time crafting, given that it was going to Henry. This was not a small gesture. This was big.
and compare that to a gift that we know Catherine gave Henry. I mean, she might have been trying to be a little bit more modest that year, sending Henry a gold cup, a gold goblet. So an expensive gift, but maybe not as showy of a gift, although Henry did admire its craft. But this is something that you cannot ignore. It's a tabletop fountain, and the sketch of it, like Callie said, still exists, luckily, so we know exactly what it looked like. There's also a description of it in the King's New Year's gift rolls, where the clerk describes it as a goodly gilt basin, having a rail or board of gold in the midst of the brim, garnished with rubies and pearls, wherein standeth a fountain, also having a rail of gold about it, garnished with diamonds. Out thereof issueth water, at the teats of 3 naked women standing at the foot of the same fountain. So, glittering with gold and jewels, this was a showpiece.
Absolutely. And I think what's also interesting is the jewels that she was putting in it. There's this whole it's called the Sumptuary Act, and there's different iterations of it that appear throughout Henry's reign and Elizabeth I's reign about who could give gifts of or wear certain clothes, but that also then tied into jewelry as well, of who could give and wear certain jewels, and the fact that Anne is acting as though she has the authority to be giving gifts of pearls and diamonds and things like that to Henry speaks volumes without really having to use any words. It's not, this is what I can do just to Henry, but to everybody around her.
Yeah, I think it was that same year or else the year after, she gave to her ladies in waiting. Each one got a palfrey, a horse. It was seen as like a smaller, more feminine horse with a saddle and like all the trippings. That's just such a lavish display of wealth and status and power. Again, it just goes into this idea of Anne knew that she really had to butter people up and she really had to show off that she was the queen. She didn't have the credit that Catherine did, the long-standing traditional queenship. So she had to really hit home this idea of her now being the queen. In terms of gifts given to her, we mentioned that one year when in 1532, when Henry basically gave her the queen's apartments, and her formal gift was, of course, all of the decorations and the furniture for that new space. But the year after that, it's New Year 1533, so Anne is already pregnant with Elizabeth. They may have been married, although the timing of their secret wedding is up for review. But this is the New Year's when Cromwell, as the keeper of the jewel house, gets the sort of memo from Henry to release the royal jewels to Anne. So there is a extremely long list of not only jewels, but again, silver and gold plate that should be given to Anne. It says to deliver to the Lady of Pembroke, which is Anne's title, Marquess of Pembroke, gilt plate, and a lot of it comes from different people, gilt flagons, salt cellars, gilt bowls, basins, candles, candlesticks, all sorts of really expensive things that should be in her apartments if she is the queen. I don't know. It's just when you look at the sort of the roles of the New Year's gifts, it's usually one thing, like to this person gets one silver goblet or something. This is 24 items that Cromwell is having to get out of the jewel house to give to Anne. So Anne had some really lavish New Year's. Like she of all of the gifts given to any of the queens over the years, Anne celebrated very well.
And why not? If you're going to partake in displacing another queen, why not have a good New Year? It's very Anne and Henry. It's very showy.
It is, but not in a. I don't want to give the impression to people that we're necessarily judging her. Like this isn't a sort of like message against Christmas commercialism sort of thing. This was a very, very strategic political move on both of their parts.
I think Anne sits in direct contrast to Jane Seymour. The first recorded gift that Henry gave Jane was actually as part of Anne's household in 1534. And it was just a standard household plate, really. But other than that, there isn't much known other than after her death in the October of 1537. Henry wasn't really feeling quite up to a big 12 days of Christmas celebration, and he actually ended up observing a very quiet Christmas at Greenwich.
Henry's next Christmas New Year's, though, was particularly eventful. In 1540, by the time Christmas started to roll around, the court was actually abuzz because preparations were being made to receive Henry's newest queen, Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves set sail from Calais in France over to Dover at the end of December 1540, and she and Henry actually met on New Year's Eve in 1540 at a stop on the way to London. Anne had landed in Dover and was coming to London, but Henry just could not wait, so he rode to Rochester and received Anne, although this was sort of an infamous meeting because it did not go very well.
No, it didn't. Yeah, as Kate just mentioned, Henry first met her in Rochester, and much in keeping with Henry's style and fashion, he liked to make an entrance. This was something Anne of Cleves wasn't very used to, so when he first presented himself to her, in disguise, performing in this mask, she didn't actually know who he was. And then it's very well documented that Henry, when he first set eyes on her, was not best pleased either. So there's nothing going right in this interaction. I don't think if you wrote it for a show now, you could have planned it any better.
Anne of Cleves, as we'll continue to see, is like the queen of awkward Christmases. She doesn't really have a good one for her first couple of years in England. The first one, she is approached by this guy who she has no idea who she is. She's been raised to be this like very humble, demure woman in line with the traditional thought, and this guy, she has no idea who he is, comes and is like, "Oh, my love," and like kisses her on the mouth, and can't speak English and she's no idea what's going on.
Oh, it's awkward.
And then Henry, I guess, is civil, but leaves the meeting telling his advisors this isn't going to work. Like, I think right off the bat.
I think it's one of my favourite Henry quotes of him just screaming almost at Cromwell, like, I like her not. And just ultimately throwing a temper tantrum about this poor woman who's just probably sitting there like, what's just happened?
Yeah, and I mean, she recovered herself very gracefully, I think, once she figured out what the hell was going on. But then it must have just been awkward for everybody because Henry's sulking for the rest of the 12 days of Christmas, and he's getting ready for this wedding that at this point he's determined he does not want. So, New Year 1541, everybody.
Can you say party like Henry and Anne of Cleves meeting for the first time?
I mean, again, though, as our modern Christmases have come to be known for awkward family interactions, our New Year's Eves have become known for regrettable decisions. So this kind of fits in with that. So this year, if you come into contact with an awkward stranger who yells things at you in a language you do not understand, you are observing a traditional Anne of Cleves New Year.
There we go. And just shout back at them that you don't like them. I think that's all right too.
The year after this, so New Year, Christmas 1541, New Year 1542, Anne had her first sort of regular Christmas at court. Although the awkward part was that at this point, a year later, she was no longer married to Henry, and she was no longer the queen. Catherine Howard was the new queen. And as we can imagine, Henry was already lavishing her with gifts. It was a very splendid Christmas court at Hampton Court that year. Everyone was a little iffy about Catherine Howard being queen, and especially they were awkward about the idea of Anne of Cleves showing up because, I mean, at least with Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, you removed one before you brought in the other. This would be the first time that two of the queens had to interact civilly with each other in the same space. No one really knew how to take, the queen's reception of the person who had been in her position, 11 months before.
But what I think this interaction does so beautifully is illustrate both of their grace and their composure.
And actually, sort of going against the typical perception of Catherine Howard as this sort of like empty-headed teenager, it shows how well-suited both of them were to this game. Because this could have been a really, really, really awkward situation for both of them, and all eyes were on them. Like, how are they going to handle it? How is Anne of Cleves going to be with her replacement, and how is Catherine Howard going to react to having a former queen sort of challenging her role in that very subtle way? And they both handled it, I think, quite beautifully.
Yeah, and I think that's evidenced through the gifts that were exchanged. Anne of Cleves, she rocked up to Hampton Court, with her small retinue, again aware of the situation, and she gifted Catherine Howard and Henry 2 horses, with a saddle and all everything that goes along with a horse. And then Catherine Howard actually reciprocates the gift that Anne of Cleves gives her by actually gifting her two gifts that Henry gave her. So that was in the form of 2 small dogs and a ring.
Once again, we actually get a really interesting account of this event through who else but Gossip Girl, Eustace Chapuis, who is still around at this point, sending letters to all of his friends in Imperial Europe and the Holy Roman Empire. So I just wanted to read a little bit of that interaction because it shows all of the awkward politics going on. So Chapuis writes that on the 3rd day, the Lady Anne of Cleves sent the king a New Year's present of 2 large horses with violet velvet trappings, very expensive, and presented herself at Hampton Court with her suite. She was received there, and she was shown to the Queen's apartments to be received by Catherine Howard. Chapuis gives an account of her interview, and he writes that Anne of Cleves actually insisted on addressing Catherine Howard on her knees. So she's showing this deference to Catherine Howard, which, not everyone was sure that she would do. And Catherine, in return, showed her the utmost kindness. The king then entered, and after a low bow to Lady Anne, embraced and kissed her. She occupied a seat near the bottom of the table at supper, but after the king had retired, the Queen and Lady Anne danced together, and the next day all 3 dined together, and then Catherine gave Anne those gifts that Callie mentioned. So actually, they seem to have gotten on very well. I mean, they stayed up late dancing together. Anne was given this place of honor in their celebrations, which she would continue to have as, what was her title? The Queen's honored sister or whatever. So it just shows that everyone's kind of making light of a really awkward situation. And I think it's interesting, too, that Henry plays as little a part of it as possible. He's like, I know I created this awkward situation for you two, but you guys can handle it.
I love it. He's like, no, I'm off. I'll see you later. I'm going go to bed. That all eyes are on them, and there is no room for mistakes on either one's part.
We're going to end the list by talking about Catherine Parr's New Year's gift. And we're shifting the focus a little bit because though Catherine Shorley was receiving these impressive, lavish gifts as queen, she had very much the same jewels as the others, for instance. We're going to be looking at some gifts that she gave and received that are a little bit different to ones that the others were giving and receiving. And that is how intimate they were. So though she was surely getting these, really impressive gifts, she was also getting gifts from her stepchildren. Catherine has this reputation as being very interested in the lives of her stepchildren. She was very good friends with the Lady Mary, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, and she was a mentor figure for both Lady Elizabeth and for Prince Edward because she was, she was more Protestant, so her leanings were more towards theirs, and she encouraged their education. So there are actually quite a few instances of Catherine giving gifts and also receiving gifts from her stepchildren that just show this interesting, more intimate family dynamic that we don't really get from the others.
If I'm honest with you, this is, apart from Anne of Cleves' triumph at returning to court at Christmas, I think this is my favourite interaction that we have in gift exchange that we have.
It's actually very touching that for New Year's 1547, there's a record of little Prince Edward writing these, what can only be called thank you notes for all of the New Year's gifts that he had received that year. And one of the most touching ones is the one that he wrote to Catherine Parr. So even though the ones for the King and Mary were very, deferential and very polite and everything, the one that he writes to Catherine is very much personalized. There's a personal message in it, and then he thanks her for the gift that she had sent him that year, which were 2 portraits of the king and herself. And she responds as his mother. He refers to her as his mother. And, she says, "I'm glad you enjoyed the gift." And then encouraging him as the future king to sort of like meditate on the success and grandeur of his father and, blah, blah, blah. But like it's much more of a like, yeah, I put thought into this. This is a very touching gift for somebody. And she's taking very seriously her role as his mother, but also the mother of the future king.
While that gift is intimate and a lot of thought went into that, I think it also stresses the utility and the purpose of gift giving at New Year's. Every gift was given for a reason, whether, it was to stress a political alliance, a political motive, suggesting monarchical magnificence. She's encouraging him, to be forward thinking and to think about his role later down the line, all whilst taking care to take a motherly approach and give him something that he can actually kind of keep close. He's got those miniatures of Catherine and of Henry that I'm sure meant a lot to him.
But my favorite gift that is related to Catherine Parr is one that she received, and this was from her stepdaughter, the Lady Elizabeth, who is the daughter of Anne Boleyn, of course. And this was for New Year's 1545. She receives from Elizabeth a translation of the French poem Mirror of the Sinful Soul. It's translated from the French into English by Elizabeth, who was 11 years old at this time. And it sounds great already, but then I don't know if anyone's actually seen it. It's very often on display at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, but it is this hand-bound book, and Elizabeth embroidered a cover for it that was, in gold thread. It would have been very beautiful when presented to Catherine. It has her initials KP on the front, and on the inside, the translation is impeccable. Elizabeth liked to make these gifts for not only Catherine, but for Henry as well. Just a little bit more intimacy, showing off her learning a little bit, like inviting her parents to be proud of her. But actually in this particular gift, she says to Catherine that this is almost a thank you gift for her because Catherine was encouraging Elizabeth's education. She recognized how intelligent Elizabeth was and how much potential she had. And this was supposed to be between them. Elizabeth acknowledged that there might be mistakes in this, so please keep it to yourself. But it's an intimate gift between, I think, a girl who is looking for a mother and the woman who finally has come to her to fulfill that role. So I don't know. It just, every time I see it, every time I think about it, it just really touches me.
I don't think you can help but be moved by that at all, really. As you said, she's 11 and translating things from French. It's a lovely one to end on, I think.
We started this episode by stressing just how formal this ritual of gift giving at New Year's is and how lavish the gifts were. And, Anne Boleyn giving Henry all of these extravagant things, and in return, she's receiving the crown jewels, and how people's worth really is measured by the worth of their gift that they give to the king. So it's interesting to end on one that shows that this process could also be very intimate as well. And the ones that are recorded a lot of the times are not the intimate ones. So we have to sort of peek between the lines there and think that some years, especially in the 20 years that Catherine of Aragon was queen, there was probably a time when she was receiving these very touching gifts from her husband. It wasn't all about the glitz and glamour. That was a huge part of it. But we have to allow them some personality as well.
Personality is often missed, I think, from lists of kind of New Year's gifts or inventories and things like that on the face of it. But then when you start digging a little bit, you can kind of see actually there's a lot of thought that's gone into this, and that there's a lot of meaning behind it.
So wishing all of our listeners a very, very happy holiday season and a very happy new year. We will see you in the new year. We are already planning a second series of episodes that's going to hit you probably later in the winter. Keep your eyes peeled on our socials, Twitter and Instagram, for more information about that. And in the meantime, if you want to give us a New Year's gift of some kind, you can follow us on any of our socials or on Spotify. And if you feel like it, you can leave a rating on Apple Podcasts, I guess, even if it's negative.
We'll embrace the New Year's awkwardness.
We will embrace it and we will make the best of it in true Anne of Cleve spirit. But if you feel like leaving us a review, it helps us be noticed on Apple Podcasts. So consider doing that if you enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for listening to the holiday special of Six Queens podcast. Next year, look for the new series of Six Queens coming to you probably later in the winter. In the meantime, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Spotify, and look for our podcast on Apple and Google. You can also read more about the Queens on our website. We are on social media. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook coming soon. You'll find a full transcript of this episode, plus the resources we use to prepare for our conversations online. Happy holidays, and long live the Queens.